Here's how to replace a water pump on a 4-cylinder Honda. The water pump is located down here on this side of the engine. To get to it, we're going to need to remove the power steering pump out of the way, the idler pulley, as well as the power steering reservoir. And the power steering reservoir just pops out of the way, and then we can tuck that inside of the fender. Make sure your engine is cold before draining the coolant. The first thing you're going to want to do is drain the coolant. So we're going to pop off the radiator cap and of course the reservoir. And then you're going to come underneath the vehicle where this drain port is and position your drain pan underneath. And then we're going to go down to the bottom of the radiator here where this petcock valve is and loosen it, and the coolant will start to drain out. And we're going to go ahead and wait until all the coolant is drained out. Now we're going to want to remove the reservoir to get the rest of the coolant out of here and clean it out. There's just a 10mm bolt on this side here that holds it to the radiator fan, and once that bolt is removed, and then lift up on the coolant jug and go drain it out. Now once all of the coolant is drained out, we can go ahead and close the radiator petcock valve. You want to make sure that you dispose of the coolant properly where animals can't get at it, because this is very poisonous. Next I'm going to remove the accessory belt. So I'm going to put my 14mm wrench on the tensioner and then use an extension wrench here and pry this forward. And once this is loose, I can pry off the accessory belt from the power steering pump. And once the belt comes out of the way, we can then proceed to removing the power steering pump. Alright, to loosen the power steering bolts, there's two 12mm bolts, one located at the bottom here, and the other one's located at the top here. And that's the bolt, and now the power steering pump can move out of the way. I'm also going to remove this 10mm bolt to give me some more flex in the power steering hose. And then now I can move the hose out of the way as well. Now because I don't want to drain the entire power steering system, I'm just going to set the pump out of the way off to the side. Next we need to remove the auto tensioner. To do that, there's one 12mm bolt that's hidden here, one in the center and one on the side that needs to be removed. But first I'm going to remove the tensioner pulley, and then take out the bolt and the pulley, and then I can proceed to remove the 12mm bolt from the back, and the one from the front, and the one from the center. Just remember that the center bolt is longer than the two outside bolts. Once all three bolts are removed, we can remove the auto tensioner. You gotta be careful, there's a nut at the back here that can come free. So this here is the water pump pulley. There's about 6 or 7 10mm bolts, 3 of them that you can see at the top here, and the rest of them are buried behind the pulley here. They need to be removed in order to take the water pump off the engine block. Alright, so I'm just gonna come in here with my 10mm ratchet and break all these bolts loose. And the top bolt. Now I'm on the bolt that faces the rear of the engine. I'm going through the pulley with a 1-inch ratchet extension. I'm going to break this bolt loose. And here I'm on the bolt that faces the front of the engine. Again with the 1-inch extension going through the pulley. I'm going to break this bolt loose now. So here's just a closer look at how I set up my ratchet to go through the pulley to get to the 3 water pump bolts behind the pulley. Next I'm going to jack up the vehicle and remove the passenger side wheel. Then we need to remove the splash guard here, which is held in by 2 clips, one here and one over here. And then we can move the splash guard out of the way. And then if we take a look at the water pump pulley here, the 10mm bolt is actually over here behind the pulley, which you can access with your ratchet through the pulley down here. And there's the ratchet with the 10mm socket on that bottom bolt. I'm just going to go ahead and break this bolt free. Alright, well I finally got the bottom bolt out. And that's why it's so hard to get these out, because there's Loctite on these. Next we're going to position the drain pan under the water pump. Alright, we're going to remove the last water pump bolt. Alright, now we're going to wiggle the water pump and get it out. And you'll notice that the block is going to drain. So make sure you have a drain pan underneath. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and remove the water pump from the engine. Alright, so here we got the water pump removed and all the coolant is drained out. Next we're going to clean off the mating surface where the gasket goes using a little wire brush. And then I'm going to use a clean cloth with some brake cleaner on it to thoroughly clean the mating surface. You also want to clean the inside of the engine block to make sure no debris gets inside. This here is the old water pump. You can see here that the bearing moves nice and smooth and it's not actually loose. Over here on the back you can see this is the mating surface. It's got a little bit of corrosion and calcium buildup from the coolant, and this is the gasket. It's actually quite brittle. I'm going to replace this. I got my new water pump gasket from Felpro, and then I'm going to bring in the new water pump and seat that down. Make sure it sits nice and flat and the gasket isn't pinched anywhere. And then I can replace the 6 10mm bolts. One quick tip to catch the bolts behind the water pump pulley is to put a piece of tape over the socket. That gives you something to grab onto while you thread it in. And once the bolts are in, we're going to go ahead and torque these down to 102 inch-pounds using a torque wrench. So now that the water pump bolts are tight, we're going to replace the auto tensioner next. and thread in the center bolt. And then we're going to thread in the 2 outside bolts, noting that these are the shorter ones. And then we'll go ahead and tighten down the 3 12mm bolts. It's also a good time to check if your idler pulley needs to be replaced. And then we're going to replace the idler pulley with its bolt. And then we'll go ahead and tighten up this 14mm bolt on the idler. Next we're going to put in the power steering pump and its 2 12mm bolts. And then we'll go ahead and tighten down the 12mm bolts nice and snug. This is also an excellent time to replace the serpentine belt if it's cracked. Next we're going to replace the serpentine belt. I'm going to first start at the crank and work my way up. Pull the tensioner forward and then loop the belt onto the power steering pulley. And then release the tension, and then we can put the power steering reservoir back onto its bracket, and then we can put the bolt back into the power steering bracket on the valve cover. So I've cleaned out the coolant jug. I'm next going to replace it behind the radiator fans, and then replace the 10mm bolt on this side, and then you can replace the reservoir cap. Alright, next we're going to refill the cooling system. Make sure you use the right coolant. You've got to use an HOAT compatible coolant that doesn't have any borate or silicate inside. So because this is a concentrate, I'm going to have to mix it 50-50 with clean water. So I've got some deionized water here, which is ready to go into the radiator. This jug is half full. I'm going to use a funnel and fill up the rest of the bottle using the concentrate antifreeze. And then using a funnel, I'm going to pour it into the radiator. I'm going to pour it slowly so that no air bubbles get trapped inside of the radiator. With the radiator now full, I'm going to go ahead and refill the overflow reservoir and then replace the overflow cap. So we're not going to replace the radiator cap right away because we need to bleed the system. So we're going to start the vehicle up and let it run. Might want to put something on top of here in case it splashes up. Alright, with the coolant refilled, we're going to go ahead and start the engine. Alright, we're going to let the vehicle warm up for a couple of minutes. You might see some air bubbles popping through the radiator. That indicates that the system is self-bleeding as there's no pressure on it without a radiator cap. And then we're going to double check the front of the engine to make sure there's no coolant leaks coming from the water pump area. You want to make sure that there's no leaks coming underneath the car from the water pump. So we're going to idle the vehicle until it reaches operating temperature. We're going to turn the heater over to the hot side and then turn the fan to the highest temperature. Finally, we can check the level of the coolant reservoir and top it off before taking it for a test drive. Never let the rain dampen your spirits.